We've talked about it before on this channel, but today I want to do a comprehensive deep dive on what actually drives the spawn and the pre-spawn, and how what you've heard is incorrect and its surprising source. It's causing you to be less efficient on the water and catch fewer fish. Stick around, we're going to talk all about it.
Got him. That feels pretty good, kids. That feels really good. Don't you run at me. Oh, that's actually not a bad fish. Oh yeah, come on, buddy. Oh, the wife's gonna hate this. I got it on top water.
Welcome back to Lowbrow Fishing, and today we're tackling a deep dive into what actually drives the pre-spawn and the spawn, and how it relates to your bass fishing. You know, we've all heard it for years, right? Water temperature is what triggers the spawn. It's what gives those bass that cue to start moving up shallow and begin the spawning process. But you know what? That's just not accurate. And we're going to take a look at what really drives the spawn and how you can go from catching a few fish to a lot more fish just with a few simple adjustments. But before we get started, if you like bass fishing content that tries to be inclusive, whether you fish from a boat or whether you're fishing from the bank, and always thinking about budget because not everyone has a lot of money to spend on bass fishing gear, then this is the channel for you. Click that subscribe button below. And while you're down there, give this video a like. I would really appreciate it. So if it's not water temperature, then what is it? Well, there is a word for it, and it's called the photo period. And it's a fancy word for the sun position in the sky. We've talked about this before, but we're really going to get into a deep dive of why it works the way it does and when it actually starts. For a lot of us, we believe that the pre-spawn starts in the spring, right? For us here in South Mississippi, those bass start to get active and start feeding as much as mid to late January, when you can go out and really start crushing numbers of nice bass. But the fact is that the pre-spawn actually has a set day when it begins. And it's a surprising day, the winter solstice, the shortest day of the year. And how do we know? Well, because we have isolated a chemical response inside those bass, which causes a chain reaction that begins the whole process. So literally, the winter solstice, the shortest day of the year, is the actual start of the pre-spawn. Because once that chemical reaction starts, there's no turning back. You know, it's like whenever you did the science project when you were a kid, or the baking soda and the vinegar, and you put them together and it starts frothing and foaming everywhere. Once you start that process, you can't undo it. And it's much the same here. Once that chemical signature and gets into that bass's brain, well, the pre-spawn is already underway, and everything after that is just academic. Now, I mentioned the photo period and why that is the actual driver of the spawn itself. And the reason is very simple. The photo period indicates the length of day. That tells us how long that day is. And again, water temperature is a consequence of that. It's not the driving force. Obviously, if the sun is more directly over your head and you're getting straight sunlight, remember, sunlight depends on the angle that it hits you. That's why the North Pole and South Pole stay covered in ice even though they get sunlight too. It's because it hits the earth at an angle, right? We all learned this in second grade science class, and it matters because the more sharply that sun is overhead, and in the springtime, or as the winter moves into spring, that sun rises higher in the sky and gets more overhead. That's why South Mississippi has a pre-spawn before Minnesota. It has nothing to do with the water temperature. Again, that is just a consequence. That is just a result of having more sun. But the bass need that sun. They need it to help warm their eggs, which is why they're laying in shallow water to begin with. Bass need the sun to warm their eggs so that they will hatch. And that's what makes it so important. So it's the longer daylight period. We can have warm water temperature and still have very little sun. That's happened before. Here in South Mississippi, well, the water temperature never really gets below 50. It's very rare that that happens, and it usually stays around that 60 to 63 degree mark all winter long. So why don't we have bass spawning here the entire time? Well, we do get bass that spawn all year long, but it happens in very small isolated pockets. You're not going to see it all the time. For the most part, that spawn in Mississippi, in South Mississippi especially, is going to take place. It's going to start in the last week of February and run to about the third week in March. So here in South Mississippi right now, we're in the middle of the spawn. Those bass are on bed. And that water temperature is not as warm as it has been the past few years. But why are the bass still spawning if the water temperature is colder? Because they have to. Now, I've heard it been said that the bass are not going to be in any water that makes them feel uncomfortable. But you are putting a human frame on that. Bass are exothermic, which means they're cold-blooded, unlike humans, which are endothermic, which means we produce our own body heat. It's a fancy way of saying that the bass get their warmth from their outside source, right? So they don't feel the same way about cold water that you do. They don't start shivering. They don't feel any differently. They may feel sluggish, but it's not uncomfortable for them. And that's a common misconception that a lot of anglers think about, is that cold water produces uncomfortable bass. But that's not the case at all. The bass, they don't even notice. They keep going on about their day. So saying that the bass aren't going to move in this area and begin the spawn because it makes them feel uncomfortable, that's hogwash. The research does not support that. Again, bass are cold-blooded. The cold does not affect them like it affects a human. They don't need a coat. They don't need to find a place warm. It only is a source of energy. Now, when I'm talking about the pre-spawn and how I'm fishing that and how I'm fishing the spawn, how is that different? Well, if you know that those bass are going to be moving up and they're going to be spawning regardless of what that water temperature is, because the spring is a time of change. Late winter into the spring, with the weather, is a time of change. It's going to fluctuate. That water temperature is going to swing wildly by as much as 10 to 12 degrees or more in just a few days. You get a few days of warm. Here in South Mississippi, we'll get up to about 80 or 85 for a few days, which is drastically going to increase that warm water. And then a cold front will come through and we'll drop back down to 65, 70 degrees or colder, even at night, down in the 40s. That's going to cause that water temperature to drastically plummet. And if it was really the biggest driver behind how those bass were going to spawn, well, we'd have a whole bunch of dead bass all over the lake constantly because they couldn't make up their mind whether they want to spawn or not because of the water temperature. It goes above where they want to spawn and goes below where they want to spawn. So that's not the determining factor. It is the photo period, the sun in the sky. The heat of the water is just the consequences of that. So what's the second thing that I want to talk about? Well, it comes down to bed fishing. Now, anybody who's watched this channel before knows that I don't fish beds. And it's because I don't need to. That's not where I'm finding the big bass. We've been told the same thing. The bass get warm, they get shallow, they get on their beds, they mate, they do the spawn, and then they move back out. But that's not so much true. It happens in phases. First of all, the males will move up. And they do it quite a bit before the females. Those are going to be the first bass that go up shallow. The females will be behind them, but they're going to hang back. They're going to be at the mouths of those creek arms or those flats, or they're going to be about midway through. They're not going to be in nearly as shallow of water. And while those males are building up the beds, and you can find them, you catch one and it's got a bloody tail. That is an indication that you've A, caught a male, and B, that it's on bed, because it's got the red lipstick and it's got that bloody tail from using its tail to brush out the bottom and clean out a spot for a bed. The females don't take part in that. The females, their job is to come in, pick a male that they like, lay their eggs, and then head right back on out in the water. They are not on bed for very long at all. But we've always had this misconception that if you want to catch those big girls, if you want to catch the biggest bass of your life, especially during the spawn, then you need to get up there on those beds and you need to find those females. You need to catch a male, pull it off a bed, put it in your live well, and then try to catch that female. Well, chances are if you caught the buck male off of that bed, There's nothing else on that bed, especially in the very early spawn and in the late spawn. Especially in the late spawn. If you catch a buck male off the bed, there's nothing there, I'm telling you. So the thing that you want to do is focus backwards, right? You want to come back off of those beds. And when I started doing that, when I started realizing and hearing from other anglers who were doing the same thing, that's when the success rate really skyrocketed. I could either go up shallow and I could start pitching and flipping shallow beds and seeing those buck males on there and catching them after about an hour and a half of having them fiddle with that bait, only to spit it back out and then toss it back out there, only then for them to fiddle with it and spit it back out, and then end up catching, you know, a pound or a pound and a half male bass, if it's a good one. All of that to me is not worth it. I want those big girls. I want those 4, 5, 6 pound plus big girls. And trust me, they are not on bed for nearly as long as you think. So it changes how we fish. It changes our perspective. It changes how we need to approach the spawn. If you're right in the middle of the spawn, if you know that your area has spawn from this time to this time, generally, during the middle part of that, yeah, a lot of those females may actually be on bed. A lot of those females may be on bed. But trust me, they're not on bed for more than 2 or 3 days total out of the entire spawning period. They move in, they lay their eggs, and then they hightail it out of there. So hang back. The mouths of those creek arms, and I've demonstrated this with video time and time again over the past few years. I used completely different baits for fishing the spawn than everybody else. I'm not pitching, I'm not flipping. I'm using things like topwater, things like wake baits, things like walking baits, things like prop baits. I'm also using things like flukes, soft plastic jerk baits. Those are also killer during the spawn and the pre-spawn because, as I said, with those bass hanging back, I can fish them like I'm targeting any other type of school. I cast a fluke out there and I work it just like I would any other type of soft plastic jerkbait. And that's when I'm catching those larger types of bass. I know where they are. I know how to target them. It's just a matter of picking the right presentation, the right technique, and getting them to commit, which that narrows it down dramatically. That dramatically narrows it down. I know where they are. I don't have to search. They're going to be toward the middle and the front end of that spawning pocket. Fish there. I'm telling you, try it. You are going to be amazed at the amount of success that you'll have. Whenever you totally rethink the spawn and the pre-spawn and you figure out this is how this works, well, it really elevates your fishing. Go on days that you don't think that the bass are going to be active in their pre-spawn, and well, you're going to find out that those bass are active in pre-spawn whether we think they should be or not. You know, one of the biggest things that I've heard, one of the biggest fallacies that I've heard is, if it was really all about the sun, then why doesn't Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Florida have the spawn at the same time? Because the sun angle is not the same. It has to move up a curved, round earth. So even though it's warm over places like South Mississippi, Texas, Louisiana, and Florida, it's still not as high in the air over Wisconsin, Minnesota, New York, Michigan, or what have you. So you're not getting the same angle of the sun. It's not as strong of a sunlight, and you're not getting that full effect. And the bass know that. So that's why the spawn doesn't occur for the same time, because it's not the same photo period. Ours happens earlier and then moves on. So by the time we get into the late summer, well, the sun actually goes down later in the summertime for the northern climate than it does in the southern climate. And that makes sense, right? During the summer, the North Pole has 24 hours of daylight. And you go down a little bit further, and then it gets longer and longer before the sun starts to set. So that makes a lot of sense. So there you have it. The real reason that the spawn happens and the driving force behind it. It changes how you approach the pre-spawn and the spawn, and it changes how you fish it. Not just where you fish, but the techniques and presentations that you use. I'm telling you what, give this a try. You will be amazed at the difference in the amount of fish and the size of fish that you catch. Thanks for watching Lowbrow Fishing. We'll catch you in the next one.